Hello and welcome, and happy Halloween. Today, we're building a full-scale Art the Clown head from the Terrifier franchise. The STL files for this build were modeled by Jules Modelato and will of course be linked in the description, along with the materials used throughout this project. So with all that being said, sit back, hold on to your limbs, and enjoy. When it comes to a build as detailed as this, print quality is paramount. Since I don't own a resin printer big enough to print something of this size in one shot, FDM printers were my only option, which means that my slicer settings, as well as the print orientation, need to be on point. The face and head portion were printed at a 0.1mm layer height, with variable layer heights enabled in certain areas where top layering is likely to occur. It's also a good idea to slow down your outer wall speeds and speed overall on a print like this. Despite my efforts, imperfections are inevitable. Due to how detailed this model is, removing them can be a delicate balance. Sanding too much in one particular spot can result in a random smooth spot in a sea of surrounding texture and detail. Filling imperfections, on the other hand, can also have the same result. To preserve as much detail as possible, I relied heavily on Duplicolor filler primer, which allowed me to gradually remove imperfections while simultaneously smoothing the entire print in a way that's uniform as to not have random smooth spots. Usually, I keep track of the hours I spend sanding during any given project. I decided not to this time around due to how little sanding there is that needs to be done. Overall, it took less than a week, and maybe a can or two total of filler primer until the head and base were ready for paint. The head was painted with 2 coats of Rust-Oleum white primer. In the past, I've struggled when using white spray paint. I found this color in particular to be runny and blotchy, regardless of which brand I use. I've since started warming my spray cans in a warm water bath for a few minutes prior to painting, as well as shaking the can for an additional minute more than what the can recommends. Warm water lowers the viscosity of the paint, allowing for better atomization and a smoother application overall. I've definitely noticed an improvement in spray quality having done these extra steps. As for the base, it was painted with Rust-Oleum's Ultra Matte Black, once again applying 2 coats. One of the many details I obsessed over and wanted to get right was the discoloration that's present on Art's face. Art's appearance is slightly different across the 3 main Terrifier films. However, one thing that remains constant is the 2 different tones of white used on the face and the head. It's subtle. Lighting is surely a factor, but more often than not, Art's face is more of an off-white with hints of yellow. I wanted to land somewhere in the middle. I didn't want the face to be overly yellow, just enough to where you can see a clear, discernible difference in color. To do this, I used a combination of Vallejo white and ivory white. Hindsight's always 20/20. My decision to glue the face and head portions together prior to painting was a decision I came to regret in this scenario. I was able to make it work, but if I were to do this again, I would hold off on gluing these 2 parts together until the face was painted with its final color. I decided to hand paint all of the black areas of the face next. Throughout the remainder of this video, I'll be alternating between paints, inks, and washes, so I'd like to pause for a moment and go over the key differences between them, just in case you are unfamiliar. Starting with airbrush paint, it's fairly thin, but more often than not is too thick to be sprayed through an airbrush, and must be thinned in order to do so. Airbrush paints can be great for hand painting models though, as they leave little to no visible brushstrokes and are quite opaque, which allows you to build out a specific color without having to recoat multiple times. Next are inks, which are even thinner than airbrush paint and can be sprayed through an airbrush straight from the bottle. Inks have a significantly higher concentration of pigment than paints do, allowing them to stain and bite into the surface of whatever they make contact with. One thing to keep in mind when using inks is that they have less binder than paint, which makes them more fluid, but at the expense of them being weaker. Inks could potentially rub off, and most importantly, could reactivate if painted over. So when using ink, be sure it's fully dry if you intend to paint over it with a different color, or seal it with a varnish or clear coat to be safe. Finally, there's washes, the most thin of the 3, which can be made by watering down paint significantly with water or thinner. I like using transparent acrylic paints as it's much easier to control the opacity. Washes can be beneficial when used for weathering, as they'll fill into the cracks and recesses in order to highlight details. They can also be used for tinting, shading, blending, and many other uses. Next, I began work on the gums and teeth. This part of the build is what I was looking forward to the most. I started work on the gums first, using Vallejo Gory Red, darkened with a bit of black. Unlike the previous section, where I applied several coats of black ink in order to build out a solid opaque color, when painting the gums, I went a little heavier on the areas furthest from the teeth, allowing the paint to thin out and become lighter in color the closer I got towards the teeth, adding a bit of realism and depth to the model. For the teeth, I used an elf skin tone as a base. In truth, I think this color was way too light, and a small part of me regrets using it. If I were to do this again, I would definitely use a darker skin tone for a base color. It's crucial that this base color is fully dry. I would even recommend sealing the teeth with a flat clear coat for extra assurance. What I did next was the weathering of the teeth, which I did by using a raw umber acrylic ink by Liquitex. Inks having a higher concentration of pigment is extremely beneficial for this application. The ink immediately stains and darkens the base color of the teeth, while also filling into the recessed areas of the gums, further adding more depth and detail. I did several coats of this ink, starting off lighter at first, then adding heavier coats as time went on and I became more comfortable with the process. Dabbing away the ink with a sponge or paper towel removes excess ink, but also creates texture and dirt buildup in a realistic way. I did end up mixing a small amount of black ink with the raw umber to tone down the overall color just a bit to compensate for the base color of the teeth being so light. Up until this point, the painting of the mouth has very much been a trust the process type of workflow. All of the work we've done won't properly be realized until the gloss is added. My end goal was to coat the teeth and gums with clear UV resin, applying it with a brush. I'll admit, I was lazy and did not seal the teeth with a clear coat. Since inks have the possibility of being reactivated, I was worried that brushing resin directly onto the teeth would ruin the finish and smear the ink all over the place. So I instead did a coat of Createx 4050 UVLS Gloss Clear, which would act as a barrier coat between the ink and clear resin. I do recognize this is probably just a case of me being overly paranoid. Regardless, it worked out just fine. Oftentimes when taking on a new type of project, I get so caught up and focused on one particular aspect of a build that I overlook and underestimate other portions of the build which are equally as deserving of my attention. A mistake which almost always comes back to haunt me. Truth be told, so much of my focus and mental capacity was directed towards the painting of the mouth. As a result of this, I didn't really have a solid game plan when painting the eyes. And yes, this did indeed come back to haunt me. Earlier when I said that Art's appearance slightly varies throughout the three films, I would say his eyes are the most notable example. In Terrifier 1, Art has black contacts with extremely large pupils. Terrifier 2, Art's eyes are natural, being those of David Howard Thornton, the actor who plays Art. Then there's Terrifier 3, where Art's eyes are more reminiscent of how they appeared in the first film, only this time having smaller pupils. It was a hard decision, figuring out which eye style to go with. Part of me loves the contacts, which give Art this inhuman look with an outright evil-looking presence. But I also think there's something downright horrifying about Art having natural, human-like eyes. It all comes down to personal preference. My first attempt at the eyes were subpar at best, and I wasn't happy with how they turned out. I started by painting the eyelids with a red flesh tone, then mixed together an off-white for the eyes, using ivory white and neutral gray. Due to my lack of foresight, I had already painted the surrounding area black, which prompted me to hand paint the eyes rather than use an airbrush, which would have yielded better quality. Using a pencil, I marked where I wanted the pupils to be, then drew them in by hand, ultimately painting them black. Just like the gums and teeth, I once again applied a layer of clear resin over the eyes. It was at this moment when I realized just how off the eye color was. My color mixture was way too gray, and the size of the pupils were way too small. In addition to that, the eyes had zero depth or detail. I I knew immediately that I screwed up and needed to redo them, so I took some time off to recenter myself and reapproach the problem from a different angle. I mixed together a new color for the eyes, this time using a skeleton bone color as a base with hints of white added to it. Because the eyes are primed black, I'm able to work from dark to light, so using an airbrush, I started at the center of the eye and built out the color towards the outer edges, being sure to fade out the color just before reaching the outer edges, resulting in natural shading, which added the depth I was missing. I then made a red wash and applied multiple layers over the eyes, slowly building up the color, tinting the eyes as well as the eyelids, resulting in a bloodshot effect. Using the same base color from before, I painted the eyes using the same technique from moments ago. It's worth noting that I thinned my paint even further for this step, that way I had much finer control over the coverage. There's a lot of freedom and flexibility in this process. Had I stopped applying the base coat sooner, the surrounding area of the eyes would still have a bloodshot look to them. I built out the color closer to the edges, maybe still a bit too much, but the end result is still one that I'm content with. The universe can oftentimes work in mysterious ways. Before I was able to attempt the pupils for a second time, a fellow maker who goes by Ghost's Museum of Monsters and Mayhem went out of his way to share with me a new method of doing eyes that he has recently found success with. That being the use of clear Waterslide decal paper. To put it simply, these essentially act as clear stickers, allowing us to print realistic eyes onto decal sheets, which can then be cut and transferred onto our models. To me at least, this technique is nothing short of revolutionary. But before we go on any further with using these, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Monsters and Mayhem for sharing this technique with me. His work has been my North Star during the preparation for this build. He is an extremely talented maker who specializes in all things Terrifier, and was kind enough to share his knowledge with me on so many aspects of this build. A link to his Instagram as well as his Etsy shop will be in the description below. I kindly encourage you to check out his work, you won't be disappointed. After downloading an image of a random eye, I isolated the pupil in Photoshop and extracted it as a separate image. I imported the pupil into Cricut Design Space due to how easy it is to adjust the dimensions of an image. After careful thought, I decided that pupils with a 0.2 inch diameter would look the most accurate. But I also threw in a bunch of other ones of various different sizes just in case. Using an inkjet printer, I printed the images onto the decal sheet. Be sure that the print quality is set to high and that glossy photo paper is selected in the print settings. After waiting a few minutes for the ink to dry, spray 2 to 3 coats of an acrylic-based clear coat over the image. Doing so protects the ink from smearing during application. Once the clear coat is fully dry, each individual pupil was ready to be cut out. I would highly recommend cutting as close as possible to the image, while still making sure there's just enough white paper visible around the edges. I could have saved myself some time by using my Cricut machine to cut them out, I just didn't feel like doing that. Alternatively, you could use a hole puncher, but I don't currently own one big enough for an image of this size, which is why I cut them out by hand. These Waterslide decals work exactly as the name suggests. Upon soaking the decal in water for 30 to 60 seconds, the white paper backing will quite literally slide and separate from the printed decal. Be sure that the surface receiving the decal is wet, then simply place it on. Using one hand, hold the decal firmly in place, and with another hand, simply pull the white paper out from underneath the decal. I then used a silicone brush to remove the excess water out from underneath the decal. The best part about this technique is that you can freely move the eye, or in this case the pupil, as much as you see fit. Once I was happy with the placement, they needed a minimum of 3 hours to properly dry and stick to the surface. I then went over the entire eye with a gentle light coat of clear resin, then curing it to secure the decals in place. I was worried if I did too thick of a coating, the decal would reactivate and move out of place. I went over the eye once more, this time with a thicker coat of resin to achieve the highest level of gloss possible. Last, but certainly not least, is the hat, which I'll admit, I almost entirely forgot to make. The hat was resin printed on my Saturn IV Ultra. After being washed with IPA, it was cured with UV light before being primed and painted black. I was on the fence for a really long time on whether or not I wanted to add blood to the model. I caved, obviously. Using red ink and a small amount of water added to it, I did a practice round on a blank canvas by flicking the ink off of a paintbrush. It wasn't immediately apparent to me based on how it looked on the canvas, but adding water to the ink was not something I should have done. The mixture was a bit too watery and transparent. Off camera, I made a new mixture, this time with no water added. I instead added a small amount of black ink to darken the color and reapplied it over the pre-existing blood. To those of you watching who are fans of the Terrifier franchise, I think there's something wrong with us on a psychological level. But you're my kind of people. I'm sure we'd be good friends. To those of you who are familiar with my channel and what I normally upload, I recognize this is a little outside the norm of what I normally do. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed, and I thank you very much for watching. To anyone else, this character and this hobby are things I'm very much passionate about. Expressing my passions through art, pun absolutely intended, is what this channel's all about. If you liked what you saw, then please consider sticking around, because I don't plan on stopping anytime soon. Lastly, I'd like to say a huge thank you to 19 Props. The music you've heard throughout this video was made by him, and he was kind enough to let me use it for this video. He's a good friend of mine who's an extremely talented maker. A link to his Spotify and Instagram will be in the description below, in case you wanted to check him out. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.